Today, you're going to get to be a part of a first in a series of interviews with performing arts professionals called Magic in the Aisles. It's the kind of conversations we have when we're sitting around between rehearsals or waiting for the rehearsal to begin on a break. The conversations are usually insightful, often funny, and give you a little bit of a view of the kind of thinking that goes behind playwriting, dancing, directing, designing. I'm delighted today to have as my special guest, Kenneth Jones, who is here to talk about Alabama Story. Ken is currently in production or in Zoom readings for a new play. And so he's going to be joining us later. We pre-taped his interview so that we would have a decent internet connection. And afterwards, we will be taking your questions. Before we start our actual interview, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background that leading up to the play. Alabama Story takes place in Montgomery, Alabama in 1959. This was 4 years after Rosa Parks refused to give her seat up to a white man on a bus in Montgomery. Ruby Bridges was still in kindergarten. She had not started her integration of the schools. Martin Luther King had just given his speech on integration at the Lincoln Memorial. On the big screen, they were showing Ben-Hur and Suddenly Last Summer. However, in the theaters in Montgomery, they were segregated. So Black Americans had to enter through a back staircase and sit in a section marked for Negroes. Water fountains, libraries, schools, all were segregated. Meanwhile, the US Postmaster General had banned the book Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, saying it was too scandalous to send through the US mails. It was a time of great rigidity, but also great change. And nowhere was it greater than in Montgomery, Alabama, the cradle of the Confederacy, but also the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. And now let's dive into the deep south of the imagination with Kenneth Jones and Alabama Story. I am going to share my screen. And then we will turn off some of your and we should be ready. Growing up in the Detroit area, Kenneth Jones started out as an arts journalist, working as a reporter and theater critic for the Detroit News, and later heading to New York to become leading writer and editor for Playbill.com. In 1998, Ken turned to writing musicals and plays full-time, with Alabama Story becoming his breakout play. Set in 1959 Montgomery, Alabama, and based on historical events, Alabama Story explores how a courageous state librarian fought the censorship of a children's picture book by a segregationist senator. It's a play about courage, integrity, books, and good people standing up for their principles in order to bend the arc of justice in Jim Crow South. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Kenneth Jones and his beautiful play, Alabama Story. Welcome, Ken, and thank you for sharing your beautiful play, Alabama Story, with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Before we delve into the actual play, I think our audience would be interested to know how Kenneth Jones, the playwright, ticks. What inspires him? Prior to writing Alabama Story, you were a theater critic, librettist, lyricist, editor. How did all of these hats inform your journey as a playwright?
I really began as a journalist and as a writer, thinking about theater and wanting to write about the theater. It didn't occur to me to be a playwright necessarily. I wasn't sure how I would make any money as a playwright, so I really thought, oh well, I know how to make money as a journalist. There are newspapers all over the country, and I can write about the theater, and that was my entry point. And with being a journalist, the rules of writing are there's a beginning, a middle, and end to every story, and every review that I wrote, and every feature story, every interview I had a beginning, middle, and end. And I think that's very similar with creative writing as well, and writing a play. And I sort of just became more and more interested in the creative side as the years went on. And that's sort of my entry point, I think, into being a writer. There's a certain I love that you're sort of limited. You have limited space as a journalist to write, and that forces you to think about structure and about shape, and that all speaks to the creative process.
And there's a great deal of lyricism in your writing as well. Does that come from your work with musicals, do you think?
Well, I think yes. I've studied musical theater for a long time, and I certainly love the musicality of words and lyrics. I think that being a journalist has informed that too. Just listening to people and interviewing, 1,000 people over a career, you listen to what the shape of their language is, and I happen to have a really good ear, and I think that also is about going to a lot of plays. You got to see a lot of shows to develop an ear, and read a lot of good writing to develop an ear and to try to think of language.
As artists, even though we work with a variety of subject matter, I think there are certain subjects or ideas that we automatically resonate with or gravitate towards. What inspires and excites playwright Kenneth Jones?
I think that I'm interested in social justice on a certain level, just because social justice and current events, it's all filled with such great tension. There's dark and light, and good guys and bad guys, and people fighting for a goal, right? Social justice goals. It didn't occur to me I was interested in this until I really started writing about a bunch of topics that that I came across. I also love soap opera and popular forms and romantic comedies, but in terms of plays, I think I've mostly written stuff that has some sort of social conscience behind it. So that interests me, and that's very much the case in Alabama Story, which was sort of my breakout play.
Turning to Alabama Story, your breakout play, how did you discover Emily Wheelock Reed, the librarian who is the crux of this play?
Well, I dig around a lot of sources to try to find ideas for plays, and reading the newspaper, which was a habit of mine since I was a kid, was sort of my path toward this play. I stumbled across Emily Reed's story by reading her obituary in 2000. I just happened to be paging through the paper, and her death made national news. Never heard of her before, and as you know, she's a librarian in the Deep South who was persecuted for protecting children's books. And that seemed, the minute I read it, to be a play. There were obvious good guys and bad guys. There were people who had strong wants and needs. There were strong contrasts. You're always looking for contrasts and conflicts and tensions in plays. So this play had a segregationist senator fighting a liberal librarian. She was from the North, he was from the South.
He was quite an influential figure in Alabama during Jim Crow South, correct?
Yeah, he was one of the most vocal segregationists at the time, George Wallace notwithstanding. Yes, he was a potent anti-integrationist. He was a segregationist. And he was in charge of the funding for the state library as well. So on some level, he was her boss because he was in charge of funding her very job. So in this story that I read, you know, it was North and South and black and white and male and female and conservative and liberal and all of the sort of juicy things you want when you're sort of just developing a play. So the great soil of the play was this real story.
You changed the senator's name. I'm curious why that change when the rest of the characters in the play are the actual names.
Yeah. So the real senator's name is E.O. Edins, a real man who he's from Demopolis, Alabama, a small town in Alabama, in western Alabama. I changed his name to Higgins, Senator E.W. Higgins, because I wanted to leave room for the possibility that he had a change of heart in his lifetime. That there wasn't much documentation really about him. There's a tiny death notice in a couple of Alabama newspapers about his passing, where Emily Reed, the librarian, was in the New York Times and the Associated Press and the Washington Post and Time Magazine, you know.
And all over Wikipedia.
Yeah, I really wanted to be, you know, I was giving him the benefit of the doubt and I wanted to change his name. He does have living relatives in Alabama as well, and I wanted to be sensitive to them. As it turns out, I would find out later, talking to some of his colleagues, that he was actually worse than I portrayed in the play. I kind of give a kinder, gentler version.
I was going to say, there's a humanity about him. He's obviously the villain, but by the end, you have understanding and maybe even a little, if not sympathy, and insight into why he became who he is. In fact, I think you even say he is in your description of the characters, he's a victim of his upbringing.
Yeah, I wanted to, you know, it's easy to make the villain just the villain, the black hat. You know, it's much more interesting when he's a gray hat. And I wanted to give him some complexity. And I also wanted to give the librarian some complexity too. She has some conflicts with some coworkers that are very painful, where she has to admit that she's made a mistake and that she's wrong. And the difference, of course, is that he's never wrong and he's never sorry, and she is wrong and she is sorry. That admission sort of became interesting in this play, and speaks to larger things about American character, and certainly an American character in people who govern us.
One of your producers wrote how Alabama Story was one of the best Southern plays he had read in 10 to 20 years. And many of your reviews comment on your remarkable ability to capture the lilting Southern speech and the essence of the Jim Crow era. How much research did you do coming from Detroit and not being a Southerner?
I think like journalism, I'm interested in researching plays. I love going through files and news clips and doing the work, the background work, essentially. And I think that is a holdover from my journalism days. I knew I had to go to Montgomery and to Demopolis eventually and really walk in the footsteps of these characters. I walked into Emily's marble hallways, as I call them, at the State Archive building. I went to the State Archives. I went to Dr. King's Church. I went to the State Capitol. I got a couple of tours of the Capitol. I was in the Senator's Chamber. So it just filled me up. And, you know, I did this in the summer as well. And if you're in the Deep South in the summer, you know what that's like. You've worked in the Deep South in the summer. It's a steam bath, right? So it just everything informs.
And that even is in the opening of your play, where they talk about the air being thick.
Right, the air is thick, which means thick with ideas, but also humidity, right? So I went down there. I talked to historians. I talked to the Rosa Parks Museum director. I talked to Black historians and white historians. I went to Demopolis and got tours of antebellum houses. Fascinating. One house, there was a docent who was Black. One house, there was a docent who was white. Very different ideas happening, very different narratives given. Yeah, I fell in love with Alabama. It's so complex. It's the cradle of the Confederacy. It's the cradle of civil rights, and there was just much to absorb. And I did end up meeting. I interviewed Emily's nephew, who was a big advocate of hers. He actually helped get her obituary in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. So he had a lot to say. He came to the Florida production in 2016 and had tears in his eyes by the end of it. It was very moving. I was also really thrilled to meet the senator's nephews, a prominent cancer doctor from Birmingham, Alabama, and a prominent lawyer in Sarasota, of all places. There was a Sarasota production, and turns out Senator Eden's nephew, Bill Partridge, lives in Sarasota. So I met him. Play doesn't make fun of Southerners. I'm not interested in cliches or stereotypes, but I am calling out a racist behavior from their family, even though I changed the name of the senator. And they said that I got it right, and they and their wives all had tears in their eyes by the end. It was very gratifying, and they brought pictures of their uncle. They brought pictures of them on a deer hunt or some like going hunting, and they smeared blood on their chests. I mean, it was just a lovely time meeting them, and they're much evolved, these men, great people who I still keep in touch with.
The catalyst for the conflict in Alabama Story is a very sweet children's picture book for ages 3 to 7 by Garth Williams, the illustrator who did Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, and Little House on the Prairie, among many others. Did Garth Williams have any idea what a firestorm he was about to set off? And how did you incorporate him as the glue for your play?
I did some very light research about Garth Williams' intentions for the play. It was much more interesting to go with his public statement at the time, which was that it never occurred to me that rabbits with white fur were blood relations to people with white skin. He said there was no political motive behind it. It becomes this sort of large monologue, almost comic monologue in the play. I think that Garth Williams certainly had a liberal bent to him. He never publicly said, I was doing this for politics. I wanted to make a statement. It's easy to open the book today with our 21st century eyes and see that a black rabbit and a white rabbit drinking from the same clear stream seems to indicate what a drinking fountain might have been in 1959 Alabama, which of course was segregated. He says no, there was no political intention. It was never meant to awaken the sleeping giants of hate. And that all becomes part of the play. And as you know, Garth is the narrator of the play. I really wanted it to be theatrical and really echo the idea of a pop-up storybook. So it's not just a docudrama. It really wants to be frisky and funny and highly theatrical. Garth plays multiple roles and wears multiple hats in the play as well.
As the human counterparts to Garth Williams' fuzzy rabbit friends, we have a story of two childhood friends who, by happenstance, reconnect 20 years later as adults. Lily Whitfield is a very privileged middle-class white woman who has spent her life in Alabama. Joshua Moore is a middle-class Black man living in Detroit who periodically comes to Montgomery to work with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. How did these two characters evolve out of the deep south of your imagination?
Lily and Joshua are definitely part of the deep south of the imagination. I think they're the perfume of the story, actually. It's a love story, ultimately. And, most great plays have love stories in them. I certainly wanted to write a love story on a certain level. It's a complicated love story. It's a story of friendship, really. Because I was writing about a true story that was set in the Deep South, and it was about white people arguing over access for Black people. Libraries were not integrated at the time. It was about laws and rules and ethics in the state capital. It was a bunch of white people fighting in a courtroom scene, essentially. I wanted to show the effect on regular folks. I wanted to illustrate what was happening in conversations between Black and white folks, rather than conversations just about politicians. Lily and Joshua very much go into their memories of the past. There's a flashback showing why they were pulled apart as children. Joshua's mother worked for Lily's mother at their home years ago. And it really is just about the way they view the world. So I created Lily and Joshua. The play is a mix of fact and fiction. Lily and Joshua are fictional characters. She comes from the senator's hometown. They both were raised in the senator's hometown. And I wanted to, the play on a certain level is a mashup of a bunch of things that I love about theater, like romance and workplace drama and memory play. And I think they give each other something by the end.
Lily has a very different view, at least initially, of what life was like as children in Demopolis. And Joshua, she says, you got to live in the carriage house. And he says, it was a dog trot. It was a shack with no running water. And it's fascinating to see how Lily, by the end of the play, finally admits she does remember all of that. Right. And Joshua gives her the rabbit's wedding as a parting gift. I mean, that's a lovely, lovely twist that you brought.
That's right. And God is very much a part of this. There's a central book in the play, and there are many books in the play because it's a play about books and libraries. And Lily is a God-fearing person. Joshua has walked away from God. He carries the Bible nonetheless as a tribute to his mother, as he does volunteer work at Dr. King's church. And ultimately, there is an exchange of books, just like there's an exchange of books in the main story. She gives him, I've often said she gives him God and he gives her the world. He hands her a newspaper at one point.
Well, she even says she can't drive. She's never limited, had to drive. Right?
She can't even drive. She doesn't have a license. She's got blinders on throughout a lot of the play and through most of her life, and it's a very limited life. He was drafted and went to Korea and got an opportunity and moved north and was part of the Great Migration. So, he has seen the world. He's much more evolved in many ways.
The one character we haven't discussed is Emily Reed's ever-efficient, caring assistant, Thomas Franklin. At one point in the play, Reed accuses Thomas of leaking the news about her purchase of the rabbit's wedding to the press. His response is both shocking to Reed as well as, I think, to the audience.
Yes, there's a couple of things happening in that story. One of the things I wanted to illustrate was that there has been a tradition of persecuting librarians in Montgomery, Alabama. And Thomas is revealed to be the former assistant of a librarian at the city library, a librarian who was persecuted for supporting the bus boycott in 1959. She later took her life. And so that is revealed to be part of a continuum, to put these characters on a continuum of the suppression of materials and the suppression of, the suppression of the free flow of information, as Emily Reed puts it. The free flow of information is very much a foundational tenet of librarianship. So that was important to include in the play. And this leads to Thomas ultimately getting out of Emily an apology, which then speaks to character
and it also speaks to Thomas's character that he would never endanger a book or a librarian. And she's now starting to get paranoid because she's so besieged by the government.
Right. And Thomas is a red herring. You think at one point. He actually did leak this. His father was a segregationist. He was raised in a racist household, but Thomas is the liberal seed that fell from, a racist oak tree, so yes, it's a surprise and a twist, and I think ultimately people fall in love with that character in a lot of ways. He ends the play. He has the last line in the play, so he really takes over from Garth and becomes a historian in a way, and then takes it forward.
And he actually, in real life, accepted the award for Emily Reed.
Well, it's complicated. I don't want to give away too much, but several people accepted the award. Emily Reed was honored by the American Library Association in 2000. Unfortunately, she had died already. It was a posthumous award. She did know about it. She was told about it, and that pleased her. And I'll just leave it at that because it's a surprise.
Alabama Story begins and ends with, this is a story about two rabbits. And each of the characters say, tell me a story. It's a repetitive but very important book ending for the beginning and end of this play. Yet that's a device that we don't really see very much in contemporary theater anymore, probably with the notable exception of Hamilton. How does this device become such the soul of the piece?
I wanted the play to really reflect theatricality and storytelling. This is a library storytelling session on a certain level. It's a librarian and a circle of children, and they're being read to. And at the top of the play, the company comes out and speaks very presentationally and turns to Emily Reed and says, tell me a story. And the story unfolds. It's a framing device, and I wanted to loop back to it at the end because the story, it really, I think, encourages the audience to say, what is my story, and what story can we tell each other? Because the play on a certain level is really just about two people talking to each other. And I think that may be the best means to solve the problems, as Emily Reed says, of the South, the nation, and the world. That was a real line from Emily Reed. And I think it's just about sharing our stories.
Since its premiere, Alabama Story has had 40 productions, ranging from large regional companies to high schools, each with their own cast, director, and designers. How have their interpretations influenced how you see your work?
One of the great benefits of it not yet being published is that I have a flexible manuscript in a way. So I've been able to see some of these productions. I've seen about 8 or 9 productions. And every time I go, I take notes and see if I can clean it up, give it a haircut, fix it, make it better. And that's been ongoing for about 5 years. It's deepened and it's leaner and meaner now. So those productions have absolutely informed what the play is. I feel like it's at its definitive version now. I just had a production in March of 2020 at the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, which gave it its first reading back in the day, and it finally made its Montgomery premiere. And that was really a very tight version. I'm really proud of the other iterations. It's a very flexible play in some ways, in that it can be in a big proscenium house. The world premiere at Pioneer Theater Company in Salt Lake City was in a 900-seat proscenium house with drops and flies and wagons and curtains and projections. It was a big bells and whistles production. And then I've seen unit sets in a 50-seat theater and a 100-seat theater and a 200-seat theater. Lots of different versions, lots of different takes on it. That's the great thing about theater, right? It's interpretive. You're a director. You've directed before. It can change with the imagination of the team.
The team, and also you have also given us little hints along the way as well. I mean, there is that wonderful touch that you have written in the play where, when Lily and Joshua first meet, she has her sweater or jacket draped over the bench. he stays standing, she's seated through the whole thing. Once he leaves and she starts to leave and takes her jacket, you see 4 whites only on the bench. And have there been other touches that designers or directors have added that you suddenly went, oh my God, I hope everyone does that?
Yes, I really like the most theatrical version possible. So I like stripping everything away and just having a bench on stage, and they move from the bench into a city park from one moment to the next. I love the idea of just turning the bench over, changing the lighting, and we're in the park. There's no move, highly theatrical. I love everything being on stage at once as well. Just, there's the conference table and there's her desk and here's a bench downstage. That all being in view is really exciting. At St. Louis Rep, at the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, the floor was covered with headlines from the Montgomery Advertiser and
I remember.
So it was very highly theatrical, right? This is a really theatrical realm. So I think the less literal the play is, the better. I've certainly written very kitchen sinky kind of plays that really want a literal set.
Right.
But this is just, it really is the deep south of the imagination. That's the clue to make it, to go, to go whole hog and be creative.
And it also has almost a cinematographic nature in your writing, where you don't want a pause for a clunky scene shift or the entire library suddenly to be wheeled on stage. It doesn't seem it's not endemic to the play. The bench is endemic, the whole park is not.
That's right. And you can just, have a lighting cue and you're in the park. That's really exciting to me. And yeah, and the scenes certainly go, there are pop-up monologues where there's a scene in her office and then the senator suddenly appears in a spotlight and is talking about his past. It is very filmic in that way, on purpose. I wanted it to flow. I wanted to have this flow of cinema in some way.
And also you created, most of the political scenes take place indoors, and the love story of Lily and Joshua take place always outdoors, where they could meet alone, basically. Indoors, that would not have been allowed in Jim Crow South.
Right. And they're even at risk outdoors. They have to be careful when they're outdoors and how she sits and he stands. He can't sit on that bench with her. Yes, and that the nature thing speaks to contrast. Again, conflict and tension and contrast. I wanted indoors and I wanted outdoors. I wanted marble and granite and stone, and then I wanted magnolia trees for them. So yeah, that's very purposeful.
And the 2 rabbits are always outdoors frolicking in the dandelions and acorns. So it still parallels the book in that way.
That's right. That's exactly right. These 2 stories never merge and meet. They brush up against each other a little bit, but at no point does Joshua storm into the library, or at no point does Lily meet the librarian. These are separate. We want to see how, it's up to the audience to find out what the connective tissue is.
Right. When I saw the New York workshop of Alabama Story back in 2015, I remember thinking, what a lovely story about books and how far we've come as a nation. Rereading the play recently, I was struck by how timely the play was, especially in the era of #MeToo and Black Lives Matter. Did you have any idea that your play would resonate so loudly today, 11 years later?
I naively thought that the play really was a love letter to reading and to access and to librarianship. I worked as a librarian when I was a kid in the library. Librarians gave me books, and I was addicted to books when I was a kid. It premiered in 2015 in a sort of kinder and gentler time. Since that time, the idea of women being persecuted, leaders being persecuted, nevertheless, she persisted, much less than something like Black Lives Matter. This really is about a woman in power persecuted by men in power. and that story is sadly timeless in our country. So I think that that pops very strongly.
And also censorship of the press.
Yes.
Who reports what's the truth and who reports what their particular viewpoint wants to manipulate to create an effect, which is sort of what Higgins and the segregationist newspaper does with a children's picture book for ages 3 to 7, calling it at one point he says it's communist propaganda and it should be burned. I mean, those are really strong words about a book about two fuzzy rabbits.
Yeah, it's materials, books, and other materials are still under fire in libraries today. Librarians are still at risk. The Freedom to Read Foundation supports librarians with legal help and money to combat persecution. And the books today that are sort of blacklisted or that people want taken off the shelves have much more to do with LGBTQ characters, themes, and interests. Witchcraft, wizardry, Satanism. Harry Potter is, a much maligned book. I think there are still reserve shelves in libraries. I don't know if they exist in every library. When I was a kid in the 70s, Judy Blume was very controversial. There was a book called Forever that was like, you had to ask for it at the, it had sexual content in it. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was on the reserve shelf. As I remember, I grew up in suburban Detroit in the burbs where people didn't want too many controversial things happening in the 70s and 80s. So the fight goes on, and yeah, it's a tale as old as time.
When I read Alabama Story, I thought how really it's a story about good people. It's about character, it's about books, but it's really about good people quietly doing the right thing to bend the arc of justice during, in this case, in Jim Crow South, but it also was such a lovely illustration of how one act of forgiveness, one act of truth, one act of courage really can make a major difference in society. Were you aware of that when you were writing it, or was that something that evolved and looking back on it, you see?
The play very much traffics in character and American character and what good character is. It didn't occur to me for a minute as I was writing it that that's what I was writing, but the characters kind of told me what the play was. And I think that idea of good character and how we behave toward one another and kindness really emerged. It wasn't planned necessarily. I'm really proud of that being the sort of the major thread, and people are often in tears by the end of the play. She gives him a gift. The librarian gives the senator a gift by the end. It undoes him. It shows good character.
And also how communication and understanding brings about change, which we could all use right now.
It is exactly what I said before, which is the free flow of information. People are always passing books to each other in this play. And I'm going to show you the world, essentially, is what these characters are saying. And here is the world in this compact form. I think the play in some ways gets people thinking about their favorite books and who gave them their books as a child or as a college student or as a high school student. It creates a memory, I think, on some level.
Since Alabama Story, you've had 2 other plays produced, 2 Henrys and Hollywood, Nebraska, as well as a Christmas review, Naughty and Nice, Tales for Adult Children. What's next for Kenneth Jones?
Well, I've just been commissioned by Florida Studio Theater in Sarasota to write a new play. They produced Alabama Story in 2016, a very popular production down there. I'd always wanted to work with them on something new, and we talked about some ideas. They gave me a table reading of my play, Two Henrys, which is set in Florida. And they called me last spring and said, we have some PPP money from the government to support artists, and we want to commission a bunch of playwrights. And they said, do you have any ideas? Do you have a seed of an idea that's similar to Alabama Story, in that it's an intimate relationship play that speaks to larger issues? And I said, I think I have a little idea. And I wrote literally a one-page pitch to them, and they accepted it within, I think, 48 hours. And they put me on payroll for 8 weeks, and I walked away with a draft of a play that they are now continuing to develop. We've been doing it all by Zoom because of the pandemic, but hopefully they seem very interested in it. I've had 3 readings by Zoom so far, so I think they are developing it toward production, so fingers crossed. But that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your beautiful play with us, Alabama Story. I have a feeling we're going to want to hear you tell us a story for many more years to come.
Thank you so much for having me.